open finance is one of the main themes across Fintech Week London. A panel on how can increased financial engagement help to improve financial outcomes, moderated by Samir Gulati, who leads the Fintech practice at Cicero AMO. Samir, as a moderator, will introduce his panel members to you.
Morning, everyone. Well, look, it's a real pleasure to be at a physical conference, finally. Long may they continue. As mentioned, my name is Samir. I'm the head of Fintech at Cicero. We're one of the UK's largest public affairs agencies. And real pleasure today to introduce my panelists for what should hopefully be a great panel on open finance, financial health, and how can increased financial engagement help to improve financial outcomes. So with that, we'll start with a few brief introductions, and then we'll kick off. And we have 40 minutes today, so sit back, relax, and hopefully enjoy. So James, perhaps we'll start with you. A quick 30-second introduction would be great.
Sure. Thanks, Samir. Hi, everyone. I'm James Allgrove. I'm the Chief Revenue Officer for a company called Fidel. What we do is connect directly into Visa, MasterCard, and Amex and provide access to real-time data on card transactions that developers can then build on top of our API to access. So we work across a range of different use cases, everything from loyalty and rewards to expense management and digital receipts, and work with companies like Google, British Airways, and Top Cashback.
Lovely. Kat?
Hi, everyone. I'm Kat Cloud. I'm the UK policy lead at Plaid. We are one of the largest global open banking platforms where you work with us and we'll help you connect to different bank accounts around the world. So we work with clients, working as the middleman or the data aggregator, as we like to call ourselves, helping connect to the world.
Lovely. Alex?
Hi, everyone. I'm Alex Marsh. I head up the UK business of Klarna. Awareness of Klarna has grown considerably over the past couple of years. But for those who don't know us, we're a European bank, global payments provider, well known in the UK specifically for our buy now, pay later products, where over 15 million consumers have used us, but less well known in the UK actually for our open banking credentials. So through our support business, we have coverage over 6,000 banks across Europe, across 24 different countries.
Avinash?
Hey everyone, I'm Avinash Agrawal. I'm a product lead at OpenPayd. OpenPayd is a banking as a service platform, so we allow our customers to use a single API to connect into multiple banking providers in order to get access to virtual accounts, foreign exchange, and access to global payment rails.
Lovely. And Alan?
Hi, thank you. Alan Ainsworth, Head of Policy at the OBIE. You've had the OBIE described to you already. So what we do is we put together standards, collaborating with people in this room and lots of others to make sure the standards work and deliver what you need, what fintechs need, so they can access data that's held at banks and then provide compelling propositions to customers.
Brilliant. Well, again, welcome to our panelists today. I'll kick off with my first question, if I may, and Kat, I'll come to you. It'd be great, and I think we've heard a little bit already today about open banking and open finance, but what do we actually mean by open finance? How will it change our perception of what financial services means to people?
Yeah, no, and exactly. Like Imran's already kind of given us a great run through of open banking and touched on open finance. For kind of just to break it down, it is really building on and expanding the access that we got from open banking, but expanding it to all financial products and services. So looking into areas like pensions or mortgages or just other sectors and allowing consumers and giving consumers back the power to own their data and make decisions on how they want to share that data, if they want to, if they do not want to, and who they want to share that data with. So if they want to share it with different range of fintechs, or if they just want to share it with one fintech in order to get new and innovative products and services. So it's really going to change the future of financial services. And obviously that is a very big statement to say, but with open finance and with giving consumers the ability to actually make decisions, get access to data that they didn't necessarily have access to before, or that they didn't fully get the benefits of having access to, gives them the power to make decisions and really puts them back at the heart of financial services.
And James, also similarly from Fidel's perspective, would you agree with that? Do you think there are particular use cases we should be looking out for useful to get your views on open finance and what it means to the consumer as well.
Yeah, definitely. So I think, when people think of open banking, they're just thinking about banking data and perhaps some of the payments functionality that's opened up through that. But yeah, open finance is really much broader than that. And it includes access to a lot of other sources of data that sit outside of the banking system. So Fidel's a good example of an open finance provider where we provide access to data that sits not with banks, but with the credit card networks. And so there's some advantages of having that data and more broadly, just more sources of data. Obviously, the more sources of data that exist, the more innovative applications that can be built on top of them. And in our case, having access to data directly from the card networks is really valuable because it's real time. So different product experiences can be built on top of that. You can send a notification to a customer as soon as they've, typed their card number in or swiped it or tapped it in a shop, as opposed to waiting for a few days for the data to clear with a bank. It's much more granular than the data you would get from a bank statement. And so again, there's some interesting functionality there around geolocation. And then finally, it's much more consistent, right? It's from the same sources, regardless of who's issued the card. And so that allows a lot of speed from a development point of view. And again, much more interesting use cases can be unlocked. So I think there's a lot of pockets of data sitting out there in other financial products that need to be opened up, and I think that's really what open finance is all about: finding those sources of data, making them accessible, and then allowing those product experiences and that innovation to be built on top.
Brilliant. And Alex, I think you mentioned this as well. People are very familiar with Klarna, but they might not be familiar with the open banking element, as you've mentioned. So really interesting to get your take on, where does open finance potentially integrate with the BNPL sector?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately it's, to Kat's point, it's kind of realization of that vision of, the choice and value being put back in the hands of consumers. So kind of the rise of the super app, versus, littered with all these different kind of channels and apps and sites that you go to. And having that control, like consumers get, better choice, they get better value. And ultimately, a lot of that burden of kind of sweeping around to either bring your information together or to make the right choice is given to you. So I think we're actually seeing that now, which is the exciting part, that kind of realization of, you wake up in the morning, you get that ping, you get that notification, the app for you has shifted your money around, it's saved you money, it's helping you make better choices.
I think around pings, we'd probably keep it just to financial services and hopefully not the COVID app. Yeah. We definitely don't want to ping from that. Avinash, from your perspective and looking at this from a product lens, really interesting to get your views from OpenPayd on this transition to open finance. What's that going to mean from a product perspective? Are we going to see massive changes when we log into our banking applications or when we log into our challenger bank apps?
Of course, yeah. So I think, at the moment with open banking, obviously a lot of focus has mainly been just around your banking data and the ability to make some payments, right? And of course, there's a lot of these PFM platforms that have allowed you to aggregate your bank data and get a holistic view of what's going on, but only in your bank account. Now, with open finance, this obviously opens up to your other financial services products, right? So you've got your insurances, you've got loans, mortgages. And from my perspective, really where it starts becoming really interesting for the user is, people can start thinking from the perspective of financial outcomes rather than just a financial service, right? So today, again, you go to a bank or you go to one provider or a couple of different providers that give you different products, but they're all kind of disparate and independent, right? But once you start thinking from an overall financial outcome perspective, I think that starts to become a lot more interesting, right? Because then, you could have these aggregator platforms, for example, or your PFMs even, for example, they can extend their services. And the user journey can almost start from, okay, what are your short, medium, and long-term financial goals, right? Give us access to all your existing data that you have via these different providers, and then we'll help you achieve those financial goals, right? So I think that's where it starts becoming really interesting from my perspective.
So the big thing there is moving from a siloed view of financial services to this wider, holistic view of what it means to be, financially resilient, for example.
Exactly.
So Alan, would love to bring you in on this as well, but also to get your sense, and we've heard a little bit today already, but what can we learn from the rollout of open banking, for example, in the UK, before we get to open finance being a big thing? What are some of the lessons that we can learn?
Yeah, no, good question. I mean, the proof of the success of open banking so far is almost 4 million individual users of open banking services in the UK at the moment. The over 100 fintechs offering active propositions in the market in the UK, and more coming, more in the pipeline as well. So the good thing about that is it's proven technology, and it's proven that it works. And that means that when open finance propositions start to come to market, there is an established ecosystem there. Established players, established fintechs, and consumers and SMEs who know how the whole thing works. But I think in terms of learnings, one of the learnings from our point of view is with the foundation layer having been built, is that the ecosystem and the collaboration will be easier this time round with open finance. So of course, when a number of us started at the beginning of 2018, there were 1 or 2 regulated organizations trying to make this whole thing work. When open finance starts, that's already there. There's an established ecosystem of technical services providers, of vendors, of suppliers, who can actually actively step in and provide open finance related propositions. So that the bedrock, the foundation layer, we've heard that already, is there. But I think a learning is, actually, I'm on roadmap number 3. Roadmaps actually work by breaking down what you need to do into bite-sized chunks and saying, let's deliver that first and that second works. What also works is you don't have to do everything all at once in terms of all of the ecosystem. What we discovered with open banking is if you focus on the big guys, the others will follow. So we don't need every single incumbent business to be actively able to share their data on day one. Maybe on day one have a few of the big guys ready to share their data so that you can then build on that basis. And then the fintechs can start to test their products, test their propositions, get it out into market. So I think what we have here is muscle memory with consumers using it. We have an established way of actually building an ecosystem and an established group of actors that can deliver those services and make it all work and make it all fit together.
And it's really interesting to hear earlier today as well, Imran's comments around 700 TPPs in the pipeline. You've got 300-400 that are regulated, a similar amount coming forward. On top of that, we're edging closer now to 4 million users of open banking enabled propositions. I'm really interested to get your views as well, Alan, on awareness. It's one of the perennial challenges with anything new is consumers may not actually know much about open banking. I think we've seen a number of reports over the course of the past years where we've seen, consumers and users not necessarily know what open banking is. Do you think that matters, or do you think the proof's in the pudding, and that ultimately when we see new use cases, new propositions, people are able to see that they're able to, better understand their own financial well-being, that's what matters? Or do you think there's a challenge there around making sure that we have a campaign of awareness around this as well?
I'm always a bit nervous about campaigns of awareness, but let me take your question and answer it in 2 different ways. When we're talking about sharing the data, I think it is very much down to the individual actor to explain how that's working and the benefits of that exchange of value to the customer. So by sharing this data with us, you're getting that. And I think that seems to be working effectively already with the 4 million. These organizations are regulated. I don't see any reason to actively campaign on that, because I'm not actually sure exactly what you would say to customers. And we've done a lot of work looking at whether we should have trust marks around this or not. And I'm not in the account information side of things, the sharing of data side of things. I'm not sure why you want to do that with this particular part of the ecosystem and not with, say, another part of the smart data ecosystem. On payments, it might be different. So on payments, we're still at very early stages of payments. We've got roughly 2 million payments going through every month. Now, that's a big increase on where we've been, but it's not really a significant percentage of payments when we look at what the Visas and MasterCards are processing. It may be that we need to do something in the payments side to give customers confidence. But at the moment, we're seeing some open banking payment providers successfully coming into the market, launching their own propositions with their own brands. So maybe that is the right answer. And I'm not saying we definitely need to do something in that space or not. And it might depend on the type of use case. I think as we get more muscle memory, we've talked about this already, but as HMRC start to enable open banking payments, as we start to see more and more customers getting used to open banking payments, we may not need to do that big awareness campaign, because every proposition will stand or fall on its own merit. So let's see how that one goes. But for me, the jury a little bit is out on whether payments need something or not. But let's see how it all develops.
Okay. Another question for the panel, and I'll start with James. Again, we've mentioned this a little bit. When it comes to better financial health, we often hear of the positive use cases. We've spoken about some of those today. Whether it's Avinash's comments around individuals understanding their financial lives a bit more holistically. It could be improved, PFM, for example, better creditworthiness, affordability, access to finance. The use cases are innumerable. But I'd be really interested in your views on how do we execute this well. It's such a big topic, moving from a sliver of open banking, which is, largely around, savings, for example, moving forward towards open finance. How do we execute that well? And what do you think the first order priorities for open finance should be?
Yeah, great question. Quite a large one. So I'll try and break it down a little bit. First of all, I'd say I think about financial outcomes as quite a broad set of things. It could be the obvious of optimizing your spending and saving money and having better financial resilience, but it could also be optimizing for other outcomes like your environmental impact or your societal impact. And so I think we have to think about these things broadly rather than how can we save consumers money exclusively, which is important, but I think not the only purpose of kind of opening up data. And then, I think there's different levels of this in my mind. First is obviously the access to the data that is out there in different financial products. Creating access to that data is the first step in being able to do anything, because you need that data in order to create any products or change any behavior. The second step is obviously having an ecosystem that sits on top of that data, that can access that data, that can drive those insights and help consumers make decisions. And so there you need to make sure that the data is easily accessible, consistent in terms of format, consistent in terms of the APIs that are used to access it. Otherwise, if you have this mishmash of lots of different APIs for every single different product or provider, then it's very difficult to build a compelling product experience on top. And then I think the final layer is really around the behavioral change that you want to instill into consumers, or consumers are looking to get help with. And so there I think there's a couple of things. One is the incentives that you put in place for consumers to kind of make use of their data. That could be lots of different things, right? That could be nudging them to change their behavior. Maybe they want to reduce their carbon footprint, and so showing them, if you take this mode of transport versus this one, this is the difference, informing them of those choices. And that's also kind of getting consumers comfortable with sharing their data, right? And so having very clear delineation of what you are sharing and with whom is very important to building that confidence and creating the right incentives. So I'd say you have to kind of work through those layers and make sure that they're all unblocked in order to kind of build products that really help people to change their behaviors and their habits. And then there's a part two, that's a lot, but that's just part one. Part two, which I'm sure we'll come on to later, which is the kind of interoperability of all the different products, right? So it's one thing changing behaviors, but it's another thing being able to automate some of those changes and help people make them easier for people to implement. Absolutely.
Kat, do you have any thoughts on sort of sequencing? What would you if you had a bucket list of things that you'd want to see in open, people don't say this about open finance as much, bucket lists, it's all about travel. But if you had a bucket list for sort of open finance related sort of propositions or outcomes, what would you like to see sort of being rolled out first?
I think I'd say we completely agree with everything you just said, that there has to be a sequencing to it. And I think we'll get onto it later, but I think it's definitely something that we need to work together as an industry with the regulators, with the policymakers, to have that discussion to try and build this out and make sure that it works in the best way possible. We have a lot of lessons learned from the way that open banking was implemented. Let's take those lessons and put it towards open finance. I think if I could give a bucket list, it wouldn't be kind of pulling out specific use cases, because we work with, a good example of a company we work with is Canopy, where because of access to open banking, because they can access their clients' payment account data, they can then pull and make suggestions for what's the best way for you to, what is your rent affordability? So it's not just actually pulling a number out of the sky based on calculations, it's looking at the actual data and saying, okay, Kat, you can afford this much per month on rent. So that gives you a better understanding of, okay, I should be looking in these areas, or I should be looking in this area. And it even includes some information that, okay, guesstimates, because obviously you can't be 100% certain, but electric, gas, all that type of stuff, to really give the customer the information they need to make a very good decision before they actually go and make such a big thing as in agreeing to pay rent for who knows how long for that contract. I think for open finance, it is just going to be looking at where are the different harms that consumers are facing, where are there the really big gaps in the market, like where could, but also then looking at that information and saying, okay, what are the quick wins? We don't want this to take 5 years to happen. I think everyone on this panel will agree, and I think everyone in this room will agree, we don't want to wait 5 years for this. Let's get the quick wins, and let's get those done now, and let's get them done to the best of our ability by working together as an industry, by working together as a market, and getting in the room with the regulators and the policymakers to get this done tomorrow.
Brilliant. And Avinash, just coming to you, sort of, again, really interesting to get your view specifically from a product perspective. How can we ensure that the rollout of open finance sort of doesn't create islands of dislocation for those people that don't opt in? Are we potentially moving down a path where if you're not a digital native, somebody who doesn't get, using financial services through an app or digitally, that you might actually be excluded from this rollout? How do we prevent that?
Of course, that's a really good question. So, to start with what James was talking about, right? We need to get the infrastructure right to start with. And I think in order to get the infrastructure right, of course, there's a lot of learnings from open banking. But one thing I think that perhaps was not considered early on was, the actual use cases of open banking, right? So there was this whole thing about, okay, let's open up this data, and then there's going to be companies who are going to build stuff off the back of that, right? That's great in terms of allowing people to innovate, but again, for me as a product person, I want to start with, okay, but what's the use case for the end user? What's the use case for the customer, right? So if we start thinking of those kind of use cases early on in our thinking of during the time we're designing and building the open finance infrastructure, right? I think that number one will help us address some of the potential issues, right? Second, I think it's about thinking or taking this to where your users are, right? Now, in the case of digital natives, yes, of course, it's easier, right? But your offline users, you can start thinking of, there's a lot of talk about digital identities, right? So can you leverage digital identities or offline identities, right? At point of sales, for example, let's say people who are not digital natives might be doing their banking or their financial services in post offices, right? So can we think of ways where somebody at the post office is verifying somebody's identity, and they have some applications, right, through which they can get access to this person's data and then provide financial services at the point of sale, rather than, let's say, on your mobile phone or on your computer, right? So I think that's the kind of thinking that we need to have in place early on in order to make sure that the non-digital natives are not excluded from this.
I think that's a great point, especially around digital identity, and it's something that was raised earlier by Ron as one of the prime use cases around the rollout of open finance and moving beyond open banking, is this notion that actually if there are 1 billion people on planet Earth that don't have any formal way of identifying themselves or access to financial services, having that thought process in mind around the use cases, empowering other user providers to maybe help to identify people could be a real game changer as well. Alex, sticking with the consumer, changing slightly to looking at consumer trends, it's quite clear, I think everybody in here will realize that buy now, pay later is an increasingly popular method of payment in the UK. I think there was a recent report that suggested 33% of UK consumers have used them, and 2/5 of those, so 42%, used them during the pandemic. So a couple questions here to you. One, what role do you think BNPL could play in promoting greater financial resilience? And then a second question, which is, what do you say to those critics who argue that perhaps it fuels unaffordable borrowing? We're talking about sort of financial health on this panel. Great to get your views on what BNPL could do, but also to address that question on borrowing as well.
Yeah, sure. So I'd like starting with the first part to kind of unpack that shift in consumer preference. So we have seen a change with consumers globally, so not just in the UK, Australia, the US, where they were already making a move from traditional forms of credit cards, to actually debit as their primary payment method. And I think that's a good thing. It's saving them interest, it's saving them fees. They're in control of their finances. So we're seeing that already. I think that has been clearly kind of accelerated over the pandemic. Now, when we then talk to consumers, and I'm sure we can relate to this, there will be certain times, though, where there is a role for credit to play in society. It could be, for example, you're purchasing online, you need security, you need safety. And actually, I'm familiar with the merchant, and credit can give you protection there. Another one which is very relevant to myself, my son smashed my phone this morning, which was kind of him. So there can be situations where you have unexpected spend and you need flexibility. And again, in those situations, credit can play a really important role versus, say, debit if you haven't got those funds in your account. So we're seeing there is a role for credit, and I think the debate that's been kind of brewing is, so what's the best form of kind of credit for people then? And I think that's where consumers have made the shift to buy now, pay later. And I think there's been three key kind of drivers as to why they see that as their preferred form. So I think first off, it's interest-free, and in our case, fee-free too. So they're avoiding some of the pitfalls of kind of interest and charges they might get on other forms of credit. So that's kind of an obvious attraction to a consumer. But actually, it's more than that. So I think if you go to the kind of the second aspect that we see is that it's tied to a specific purchase. So unlike, say, a credit card where you have this kind of facility, you're assessed up front, and then people just spend and spend within it. And often, it's been proven that people spend essentially to their limit, typically. It's tied to a particular purchase. We assess each individual purchase. So again, I think for consumers, they can very much relate to that purchase and the payment. And that leads on to then the third aspect, which is around having a structured repayment plan. So again, compared to other forms of credit, we have very much a structured repayment plan that helps keep consumers out of debt rather than in debt. So I think we've seen that kind of shift, we understand why, and actually I think the open banking, open finance is super relevant, because I think one of the key aspects that we need to address in our sector is around having that kind of real-time, full 360 view of how people are using these products and other products. And I think that's the tools, I think, within open finance and open banking can really help, us as lenders, but equally for consumers, to make sure that they have that kind of, they're using these products responsibly, and they have that visibility. As I said at the start, you can find yourself now going in 5 up to 10 different apps to kind of see the different products or payments, different credit cards, different buy now, pay later payment providers. So actually having that view together can really help people, I think, in terms of making the right decisions when they're purchasing.
So having that facility, making sure that it's structured, it's flexible, interest-free, late fee-free as well, all provide some of those safety nets for consumers that sometimes will find themselves needing to purchase something, and it could be something essential, but not falling foul, for example, of predatory loans or going towards a mechanism where you're charged exorbitant interest rates. Great to hear that. And on sort of those critics around sort of unaffordable borrowing, or that potentially, is it sort of lining up consumers to spend more versus saving? Do you have a view on that?
Yeah, so I think, it comes back to that piece around people have been using credit for centuries, and they use it for specific circumstances. And we're very clear that we don't see people using buy now, pay later for every purchase. It is for those specific purchases where they need either the security or that flexibility. So I think that's really important, and that's a message that we've been trying to sort of educate through our consumer base in the UK very strongly. I think looking ahead, I think there have been new entrants coming into the market. They can often look very similar, and they haven't necessarily got all the same protections and kind of structures in place to support consumers. I think the important part for the sector, though, which is really important to bear in mind, is that we're a merchant-funded model. So we receive a fee from the merchant to provide this kind of flexibility. We don't then move people from interest-free products onto interest-bearing products. So we have no incentive to offer these products to consumers that we don't believe will repay in full and on time. And I think that's a very different incentive in terms of alignment to the consumer compared to, say, credit cards, where the most profitable consumer is one where they start using the card and actually they are unable to pay off the full balance in time and then start paying interest, and that drives the revenue of the card provider. So I think that understanding in consumers has helped also drive that shift where they see this actually as a better alternative when they do need that either security or flexibility.
Brilliant. I think we've got about 10 minutes left, so I'm going to shift gears slightly towards regulation. Again, would love to get the panel's views on this, and I'll start with Alan. Where are we at the moment in the UK, in terms of our moment towards, this journey of the rollout of open banking? There's lots that's come out. We've seen a smart data sort of spring report that's come out. We've seen the FCA feedback statement on open finance. Really interested to get your views, Alan, on where regulators perhaps can help shift the dial, or indeed if they're needed to shift the dial in terms of the rollout of open finance.
Yeah, I think it was interesting what Imran said around President Biden's executive order on this in the US. That even in the US, there's a recognition that this stuff needs a bit of help from regulators, in their case, the CFPB. And we also heard from Imran around the fact that you do need to prod people to make this all work. And some of the commentary on the US shows that some banks willingly will provide APIs, some may not. And of course, it's maybe more complicated out there with the number of banks. But I think you do need a little bit of a regulatory nudge to make sure there's consistency. And what we've seen, one of the big differences in the UK between the UK and the rest of Europe has been that we've had the open banking implementation entity, ensuring that not only that the big banks conform to the standard and ensure that those APIs perform well, but also fulfilling a role of being a kind of ecosystem hub to solve ecosystem-wide problems so that things can work effectively and also, smoothly for API users. So we've seen a very flourishing ecosystem in the UK, and it is not by accident. The UK's preeminence in open banking is not something we should be taking for granted. There are reasons for it. We've been fortunate in having the CMA, in having the FCA, in having HM Treasury being at the forefront of this, and whether by luck or by judgment, we've had a regulatory environment which is good for open banking in the UK. So let's not sit on our laurels and let that just sink in and happen. If we want to get from the 4 million to 20 million, if we want open finance to happen, we need the regulators to do what open banking providers have been doing and collaborate to ensure we have a regulatory regime fit for open finance, fit for smart data. So whilst that's not a criticism of the regulators, what I do see is a lot of not constructive single pieces of legislation earmarked to make this happen. We don't yet have a timetable for smart data to happen in the Queen's speech. It wasn't mentioned in the recent Queen's speech, which means that any legislation can't happen for at least a year. So we need that. We need the politicians, as they were with open banking 3-4 years ago, to get together and agree how we are going to make open finance, smart data, and the digital economy really take off and happen. So I do think there's a bit of a gap between what is said in lots of reports and a little bit extra political leadership to make it really happen and make it take off.
Brilliant. And Kat, just bringing you in on that as well, presumably you'll echo a lot of what Alan says, but also I know you've also sort of mentioned from Plaid's perspective the idea of a consumer data right as well. So just really interested to get your thoughts on where we are in that sort of legislative journey and are we moving towards a consumer data right?
Yeah, no, I think, and exactly, I agree with everything Alan just said, especially on the latest Biden announcement. We are very happy about that. Obviously, my US counterparts are very excited by that news. But from like a UK perspective, when we talk about a consumer data right, like, yes, obviously we have the CDR in Australia, but this is more focused on just taking the bare minimum of what we got with open banking, of just allowing customers to make the decision and to access and share their data with a third party, and building that out and just expanding it to other financial sectors. So exactly what open finance is and what we've been talking about this entire panel and this entire event is just building on that basic need of just having a consumer be able to go and access this data and share it with someone else. Obviously, you have to have security, regulation, all things to ensure there's no fraud and to ensure that the consumer is protected. But it's just giving them that right so that they can own their data, make decisions, and start actually living a better financial life, one that is, but also it's like a better financial life, but also just thinking about their environmental impact or their societal impacts and making better informed decisions on just a daily basis. So I think on that roadmap, we do have a lot of steps to go. I think it is very easy to sit and say, oh, let's just blame the regulator, they haven't been fast enough. But I think we're also in a very unique position in that for most people in this room, this is probably the first time you've been in a room with this many people. We have just come out of a pandemic. We're still, for the most part, doing out the vaccine rollout. Like, we're in a completely different environment. Like, no one saw this coming. So I think it does make sense that, okay, open finance hasn't been as fast as we wanted it to, but we're starting to see that shift change. We're starting to see BAYS releasing their smart data report. We're starting to see the FCA with their feedback statement. We're seeing the right moves being made as we start to also see the end of the pandemic come closer in view. So I think, yes, it was a bit slow, but it makes sense that it was slow. And I think it was the right decision for us to kind of maybe put this on the back burner, get open banking up and running. And we've seen a lot of customers that wouldn't have normally been our target audience for open banking have really taken it up. So we saw a huge spike in the 60+ clients taking this up and starting to use our products and making better financial decisions because they couldn't go to the bank because we were in a lockdown. So we saw a lot of impacts of open banking, and I think we are taking those next steps that we need to get open finance done within the next couple of years.
Excellent. Last couple of questions before we sort of do a few concluding remarks. James, really interested to know and hear of and read of Fidel's expansion into the US. Again, really very useful to get your thoughts on the differences between the UK and the US when it comes to our approaches to accessing real-time payments data. What are your thoughts on mandating of rules, which we've done in Europe and in the UK, versus generally letting the market get on with things, which has been the case up until last Friday in the US? So just useful to get your thoughts on the differences in the approaches and what has that meant for our relative strengths of our ecosystems.
Yeah, so we've recently expanded into the US. We're working with Google on the GPay wallet, and the reason we're kind of working with them is because it is very difficult in the US to get access to the right sources of data to build certain product experiences. And so I think there's a lot of need for this in the US and kind of more of a push around open banking and open data in the US. Now, I don't think it's any secret that traditionally the US regulatory model is much more let the market figure it out and regulate it later, which has been the approach up until now, versus in Europe, having a bit more of a mandated approach to regulation. Now, there's pros and cons of each one. We won't have time to go into that, but I do think that it is a welcome move of the Biden government to be pushing a little bit more on this, especially given the pure number of banks that exist in the US. There's thousands of local and regional banks, and so you do need some sort of standardization and regulatory push in order to create access to all of them. It's a little bit easier in most European countries where there's a smaller number of more concentrated banks. And so I think that's very welcome. But yeah, in the meantime, that doesn't prevent other approaches to opening up the data, and some of those are necessary, like I mentioned earlier, to create certain product experiences that may not be possible through banking data and may require other sources. And so, yeah, I think you can have this kind of dual track approach where you're encouraging banks or mandating banks to open up their data, but also encouraging, openness of other financial products and data sources. So I think there'll be an increased convergence between what's happening in the US and what's happening in Europe.
Brilliant. And Alex, final question on regulation to you. Again, another industry which typifies the balance that needs to be struck between innovation and regulation is of course, BNPL. We know, of course, the government is soon consulting on regulating the sector. Again, just generally really useful to get your views on what you'll be calling for as part of that process. How do you think the sector can perhaps better help to protect consumers and their financial health?
Yeah, so I mean, we touched on the significant growth in the sector. So I think it's absolutely right and appropriate that government and FCA looking at regulation of this sector. I think the positive sort of sentiment that we have with our UK regulator, with the FCA, and Avinash touched on it already, is that focus on outcomes. And I think that's super key. And I think you look at the duty of care work the FCA are looking at, and kind of more broadly, their messages, it's looking at the outcomes that consumers are receiving. I think already our sector actually is delivering better outcomes than many of the existing regulated products. So I feel very hopeful that the FCA can find the right balance between protecting consumers but also driving that innovation and competition. I think in some aspects you see regulation poor regulation, prescriptive regulation can inadvertently protect the incumbents and the kind of traditional banks. And I think there's an opportunity here, build on post-Brexit, the sentiment of the Khalifa review to actually, support innovation but protect consumers. I think a few reflections on the sector as a whole. I think actually it's taken many proactive steps to address some of the challenges that have been raised in items like the Willard review. So I think transparency for consumers, at the pre and at the point of applications, it's been well progressed. I think the areas which we need to look at and regulation can help is around credit assessments, affordability and visibility of use of these products. And that's where, again, I think open banking, open finance can be a really exciting opportunity to address those challenges. We know structurally in the UK, there are difficulties with credit information, the timeliness of the kind of credit information market, the completeness of credit information, and that can exclude individuals, people with limited credit history, people with damaged credit files, from low cost or in our case, zero cost credit. So I feel very hopeful that regulation actually can help accelerate some of the progress in that area particularly.
Brilliant. So key messages there: transparency, affordability, credit assessment and credit assessment checks and credit worthiness, and also just understanding the appropriability of the product.
Yeah, ultimately it's about these. I think fundamentally these are better products than credit cards, for example, and other credit products. But ensuring that they're taking all the steps we can to ensure that they're responsibly used is an absolute priority for the sector and for us at Klarna.
Brilliant. So look, final parting comments from our panel. Alan, I'll start with you. But 30 seconds, just your key takeaway for the audience today, and perhaps also reflecting on, is there one thing that you'd like to see in the development of the open banking, open finance ecosystem, sort of in the immediate short term?
Yeah, a couple of things. First thing is we haven't talked about savings very much, talked about lending a lot. And one of the things that I noticed on the tube, there was an advert that said, you can use open banking, I won't name the provider, to help you save. One fact is that roughly 20% of the population has less than £100 in liquid savings. And that during the pandemic, those people with the lowest savings levels have seen their savings levels decrease, while those with high levels of savings have seen their savings increase. And so there is certainly room for open banking and open finance to improve financial health. The second point I want to make, and this is probably more than 30 seconds, is we need another roadmap. Now, of course, we've had 3 in open banking. We need one that takes us from where we are today, the foundation layer of open banking, into a digital economy where we have customer data right to share your data with whomever you choose for the benefit of you as an individual, as an SME. We need a roadmap to take us there that takes us through open finance, from open banking, and into a wider access to data sharing economy.
Superb. Avinash?
Yeah, so I think we've talked a lot about how this is going to benefit consumers and SMEs, which is great, right? But I think ultimately for things to succeed, what we must also think about is how does this actually benefit the financial service providers, right? Because ultimately they're the ones who have to make this data accessible. Now, yes, you can regulate, right? And you can make things mandatory via regulation, but overall, how easy to use, how friendly, how performant they kind of make these systems. Depends on them having some incentives as well, right? Especially commercial incentives, because at the moment for most of these service providers, it's this is almost a cost center, right? And regulators have to think about how they can make this as sort of turn this into a revenue center for these providers as well, to ultimately then impact consumers in terms of how well they can use these services.
Excellent. Alex?
I'll keep it short. So I think at a micro sector level, super excited about open banking, open finance to help in the decisioning, to make sure the products are offered responsibly. I think at a macro level, kind of broader than our sector particularly, I think the opportunity, I think consumers have tolerated really poor service in banking in the UK for decades now, and you see like horrendously low Trustpilot scores. People would rather go to the dentist than deal with their bank. And I think I'm genuinely super excited about the potential for open banking, open finance to put back the control and the data, but also the money and the savings back in the hands of the consumers rather than the large banks.
And I think another one was you're more likely to get divorced than you are to
leave
banks.
your bank, exactly.
Yeah. I just got married in October, so that's not good. Kat?
So I think first, a massive +1 to Alan. I think we need a roadmap, and I think it makes sense that that's the next step. It provides that clarity that the industry really needs, and I think, but just the clarity that the industry needs, a clarity that even consumers need, just to understand, because we've been talking about this, and we've been talking about open banking for years, but it's like, okay, we're already hearing from our clients, like, what's next? Where are you guys going to go into next? Like, what's your next sector that you're going to try and get access to the data? It helps us in our kind of decisioning as well. So I think definitely that, but also just talking about the data. And it's a lot of data, let's be honest. It's a lot of data. We've seen a lot of data with payment accounts, but just making sure that we're looking at the data and we're understanding, okay, how is the best way to access this data? Is it via APIs? Is it via something else? But making sure that that is a decision that if we go down that road, that we know this is the best way to do it, and this is how we're going to unlock access to it.
Brilliant. And final word with you, James.
All right, no pressure. I'm most excited about, and I think this is where most of the impact will come from, is when all financial products are interoperable and programmable, essentially. So that will allow real impact to benefit consumers. We've obviously talked a lot about data today, and that's important, and that's the first step. But really, that interoperability and that programmable nature of financial products is where the consumer will benefit the most, and potentially the most innovative financial providers will also benefit the most. So, why shouldn't your current account sweep money back and forth to a savings account every night to make sure that you're making interest on it? If you have a high enough balance, maybe that should be swept into your pension, etc. So all sorts of decisions like that can be made in order to benefit consumers. And similarly, I think it can go way beyond that. Like if an app knows that you've recently moved house, it could modify your insurance policy to make sure you're not over or underinsured. And so having everything connected and working together is really where the impact from this will come from. And so I think that's really the kind of most exciting part of everything that's going on in open finance.
Brilliant. Well, look, thanks again to our esteemed colleagues and panelists today. Really insightful, I think, in terms of the future, moving from open banking to open finance and what that brings. So hopefully you've enjoyed it today. Enjoy the rest of your day and look forward to connecting as well. Thanks very much.